Well, welcome to Vanderbilt University Libraries. I'm Mary Anne Caton, and this is Andrea Kikkert. And Andrea, can you tell us how you came to the library before we get started?
Gladly. So I came to Nashville in 2012 to begin a PhD program in German. Wrapped that up in 2018, and then this past year I've been serving in the Center for Digital Humanities as a Mellon postdoctoral researcher. In this coming year, I'll be leaving Vanderbilt and beginning as a visiting assistant professor of German at Hampden-Sydney College in Virginia.
Great, thank you. Well, we're going to talk about book love today, and one writer, Laura Miller, says that the first book we fall in love with shapes us every bit as much as the first person we fall in love with. She and many of us believe that this emotional attachment affects choices we make as an adult. If you can reflect with us a little, we'd really enjoy it. And can you tell us what the first book you fell in love with was?
So I love that question, and I have an answer, which is even better. It's entitled Owl at Home. I can't remember the name of the author, but it's one of those I Can Read books that they have. And the protagonist is an owl. Not every single vignette in it is at home, but I actually recently retrieved this from my parents' home to show to my husband. He is an American, and so we have a lot of fun with cultural exchange, and this is certainly kind of a childhood artifact that he wouldn't be familiar with. And when he read it, well, we read it together, and he said, "Oh, yes, I can see why this is your favorite book." And he didn't expound upon that, but I think one of the reasons I enjoyed that book so much is, well, I loved books that were anthropomorphisms. And that particular one, the owl is just at home. There aren't other characters other than nature in it, or objects. And among the different little chapters, there's one where there's banging at the door because it's a really wintry, blustery night, and he welcomes the winter in to his home. He comes to the conclusion after snow has filled his home and his pea soup is just a hard green frozen thing in his bowl that winter was not a very considerate guest, and he would not invite winter in again. But fortunately, winter just slammed the door behind itself as it exited. And then another story is he's in bed and he becomes afraid of these bumps at the end of the bed. And when he pulls off his covers, it's just his feet down there. But his imagination kind of runs away with himself, as it does for me, at least at night as a kid and still as an adult, where what if these bumps just grow bigger and bigger and overwhelm me? And the way he kind of copes with this ultimately is he goes downstairs and sleeps the rest of the night in an armchair. And I have some fears that I really don't overcome directly. I might try confronting them a bit, but sometimes I just gotta cut my losses and sleep in the armchair. And I think those are the reasons that it appealed to me, was just sort of his imagination and sort of friendliness. Like, I think he regretted welcoming the winter in, but boy, he was up for extending that invitation. And he also had kind of a sweet soul. So there's another chapter about, I think it's called Teardrop Tea. It's where he ruminates on sad things, like the spoon that fell behind the oven, or the mashed potatoes left on the plate never eaten, or a clock that stops and never is wound up again because no one is nearby to do it. And he brews a tea from his tears then. He said, at the end, it kind of says, it's a bit salty, but it's always worth it to have teardrop tea. And even as a kid, I suppose I was a little melancholy, or I wanted to be melancholy. I think I saw that as kind of a sign of life experience and maturity in some way. Yeah, I think that kind of was a fun journey to take, and that's the role that books have played for me throughout my life. Kind of a refuge, but then also not a mere retreat, but a jumping off point for exploring other worlds and thoughts and people and places.
Thank you. Was there a book that captured your imagination as a reader before college or in college? Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So I really enjoyed historical fiction a lot when I was in high school. And Mary Stewart wrote a trilogy kind of based on Arthurian legend. And so I read The Crystal Cave, and I really like origin stories a lot of that sort, where you kind of have these bare bones of history, or perhaps it's merely myth, but then an artist is able to kind of fill that in and build this whole world. And I really liked that mix of fact and fiction, or perhaps, the traces of oral tradition that's still there kind of being transformed and brought into literature that we today can enjoy.
Is there a book that set you on your professional path, and what impressed you about it?
That's a good question. I don't know that there is one book, although, so I studied music as an undergraduate and continued with piano after college before beginning with German studies. But when I was in college, I remember reading a book called Gilligan Unbound by Paul Cantor. I believe he was a Shakespeare scholar at UVA. And that was and remains a really good model of secondary literature. For me, he basically reflects on 4 different television shows and talks about how these series that were very popular, I think it included The Simpsons and Gilligan's Island, Star Trek, and then X-Files. So I was born in the early 80s, and so I was familiar with all of those different series. And he writes about how those television shows reflect a political zeitgeist, and that's why they were so exceedingly popular. So, the Everyman in Gilligan's Island is there, whereas in The Simpsons, you have kind of a multicultural look and a cynicism about capitalism and things like that, whereas, in Star Trek in the early episodes, you're going out into space and you're like spreading the good things that, the Star Trek people have to share, which is like Western democracy kind of. And you're like imposing that or implanting that into these other foreign worlds, foreign planets. Whereas X-Files is just riddled with this doubt about the goodness of government and kind of uncovering all of these secrets and kind of seedy things that are going on. And to me, it was the first time, while one might debate whether these shows are literature or not, this literary scholar had looked at those different media with an eye to, to culture and to political and sociological context in such a way that helped me appreciate the shows more than I did before. And I think that's something that I would really like in my scholarship, is to kind of maybe introduce new works of literature to people that otherwise wouldn't be familiar with them. But even if they are familiar with them, maybe to cast them or frame them in a different way so that then they are compelled and kind of delight in returning to those works and seeing them through a different lens and seeing some other layers and perspectives that are within it.
That's really interesting, thank you. Is there a work in your work, is there a book that influences you?
Well, I think what I just shared certainly would do that. It would serve as that. But one of the first theoreticians for literary theory that I read in graduate school was Nicholas Luhmann, and he is kind of a controversial figure. He was sort of Habermas's foil. But he wrote one book called Love as Passion, I believe is the name of it. And the subtitle is The Codification of Intimacy. And he writes about the ways that, language is too cool for such a hot emotion, and how we see this tension as modernity is kind of more and more apparent in literature itself. And it helped me kind of think about the medium of literature in such a way that was new. And he also, his kind of approach or method for analyzing literature is pretty convoluted and confusing. And when I've tried to read more of his things, it's gotten a little tricky. It's not fun reading, but he himself is extremely well read, and so he was just pulling on this just huge corpus of just intertextuality. And he also uses systems theory, which is relies on kind of binary relationships. And I was intrigued by the way that such a strict and given limited analytic approach, how it also though opened up different ways of viewing texts and different meaning and significance that you could find there. And that in turn, I think, is one of the reasons that I have continued on with the digital humanities as well. Or what are the ways that sort of the binary basis of the digital world can kind of expand humanist approach to research? How does trying to use these models that seem totally contrary to the kind of ambiguity or liminal spaces that we delight in the humanities, how does that kind of challenge us to have still another lens through which we're considering our work?
To switch topics a little bit, is there a book that you like to share with your friends and family or coworkers?
Yeah, there are two, actually. Two of my favorite authors are Madeleine L'Engle and Ursula Le Guin. And Madeleine L'Engle's book, A Circle of Quiet, is one that I love sharing with people because it's just delightful. I think she also reflects on playing Bach inventions in that book. I know later in that series, I think one of them is entitled Two-Part Invention or something like that. But she also reflects on that in this book, and I always delight in people's reflections on music in literature when it's casual. I'm not as big of a fan of musicological works, to be honest. And then Ursula Le Guin's The Wave in the Mind is a collection of essays and poems that she's written. And she loves reading and literature and writing, and she herself is an excellent writer, of course. And yeah, it sort of rejuvenates my love of books. At times it can get a little slow when that is your, I'm still a year off of writing my dissertation, so I've got to say that I don't always have positive associations with reading, because that was a difficult process for me. But I would often go to that particular work, actually, as I was working on my dissertation, to kind of see, writing can be less systematic, but still very clear and inspiring and fun.
Can you tell me about a gift book that you remember?
Would that be a book I received as a gift?
Mm-hmm.
So my parents gave me a Bible that was one of those parallel Bibles within my first couple years of learning German. And I've forgotten what English translation of the Bible it had in it, but then it had Luther's translation next to it. And that, looking at those, when I've read of it, in particular when I would look at the Psalms in that, I just really came to appreciate the ways that language can lend deeper meaning, or you have different associations in different languages. And so that's one that comes to mind.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing your book loves with us.
Thank you.